If you think a cat is just a pet that naps in sunbeams, wait until you hear what happened in a quiet town when a black cat became the lifeline between a family and their missing child. Because this is not a simple feel-good tale, and it is not a miracle written in the stars. It is a chain of ordinary choices that collided with an extraordinary instinct. And the first 3 minutes of this story will ask you one pressing question. What if animals can sense danger and need in ways we still fail to understand? And what if the next time something inexplicable saves a life, it comes with whiskers and a quiet step, not a siren or a headline? The day began ordinary and gentle, with morning light falling soft through kitchen windows and the kind of small domestic details that make a house into a home. A coffee cooling on a counter, a small plush elephant left on a rug, the baby monitor's faint static somewhere in the next room. Sarah folded laundry with that slow, automatic care of someone who knows the day ahead is ordinary and safe. Daniel kissed her forehead and left for work early as he always did. And Shadow the cat, a silent black figure who had found them years before, stretched, blinked, and claimed the sunlit patch near the back door as his own place of calm. The family had never thought twice about the open back door, because in that town a yard was an extension of living room, and neighbors trusted one another by habit rather than laws. So when Sarah put little Emily down on the blanket and stepped outside to hang sheets, she did the same thing she had done 1,000 times before, a decision that would, that afternoon, turn into the hinge between relief and unimaginable fear. The woods behind their yard were not wilderness in the terrifying sense, but close, thick-rooted trees and tangles of undergrowth that had always seemed like a friendly border, where children chased frogs and teenagers rode bikes, which is why nobody had imagined the possibility of a baby slipping far enough into that green to be swallowed by Shadow. And yet infant curiosity is quiet and concise. A single decision to crawl toward a sunlit leaf or a scuttling beetle can bring a child beyond the line of sight in a matter of seconds. And so it happened on that late spring morning. Sarah returned from the line with her arms full of sheets, and for a single second the house smelled only of detergent and warmth. Then she looked down, and the blanket where Emily had been lay empty, a small toy, askew on the rug. The blood that tightened in her throat was the kind that stops the world from functioning by degrees and forces every tiny sense into a loud, panicked clarity. She called at first with a voice she expected to be answered by a small giggle, then louder as realization unfurled, each syllable a carved cry, and neighbors came fanning into the yard, and someone dialed the local dispatcher. And within minutes, people who had never met were knee-deep in that same terror, because a missing baby changes the geometry of a town and makes strangers into family in an instant. But while search teams formed lines and police marked sectors and volunteers with flashlights pushed toward the tree line, Shadow was already moving on a separate, quieter mission. He had slipped from the back step and padded over grass and into the fringe of trees with that cat-like ability to be both there and invisible, and he followed sounds too small for most adult ears. A hiccup muffled by leaves, the soft scrape of a small hand, the particular cadence of breath that belongs only to the very young. And what made him different from every other animal in the yard that day was not that he moved, but that he moved with a clarity of purpose, a steady forward that looked to anyone watching like a creature guided by an unseen thread. By the time the sun leaned lower and radios began calling in coordinates, the official search had already grown into a careful, methodical operation. Lines of people, space to sweep the forest, dogs with handlers to pick up scent trails, lights bobbing like distant stars as the undergrowth swallowed them. And still Sarah and Daniel ran and shouted and checked fences, because the heartbeat of a parent is an engine independent of sleep, nutrition, reason. And then someone spotted the cat, a small black shape at the forest's edge sitting perfectly still as if waiting for the world to make the next move. And because humans tend to treat cats like ornaments, they almost missed the crucial thing. The cat didn't flee from the commotion. Instead, he looked at the crowd, then toward the trees, and made a clear, decisive step into the woods, pausing only to check back as if ensuring that at least one human followed. It was a volunteer who first trusted that odd pull to follow an animal that normally would avoid crowds. an older woman who had spent her childhood on farms and raised her own kids with more listening than lecturing. She saw the cat's gaze and the steady pace and felt a nerve tighten in her that said, "Follow this." And so she did, calling 2 officers to come with her because logic and instinct together make better choices than either alone. They moved cautiously, flashlights held low to keep from startling wildlife, and Shadow led them through a narrow channel of broken branches where the ground was softer and the air alive with the smell of damp earth and crushed leaves, an area no one had thought to check because it was difficult to cross and because everyone naturally followed the flatter, easier paths. Shadow did not race or pounce. He paused at lateral turns and waited, head tilted, then walked on only when the humans behind him cleared the obstacle, and that strange partnership, animal and human moving as if by a silent choreography, allowed the searchers to slip into a part of the forest the wide, organized sweep had missed, the sections where sound was swallowed, and where a small child's cry could be muffled by the canopy. They pushed forward, boots snagging, sleeves tearing on thorny branches, the cat always a few feet ahead, and then he stopped abruptly at the edge of a shallow hollow where fallen logs and moss made a small, natural cradle in the earth, and for a beat the world thinned into a single silver line. There was something pale there among the brown leaves, and the volunteer's flashlight cut through the dim to reveal a small mitten, a smudge of fabric, and when she knelt and pulled back leaves, the outline of a tiny sleeping body curled against the trunk, stared back with a face dirt-smudged but breathing, and Sarah's name broke from a throat so thin with relief it was barely sound. The minutes after discovery were both frantic and gently reverent. Someone wrapped Emily in a thermal blanket. Someone else called for medics. Someone cradled the small head with hands that wanted to do nothing more than press every danger away. And all the while, Shadow stood not as a wild blur, but as a calm sentinel, tail wrapped around his paws, eyes sweeping over the gathered humans like a creature that had finished his task and returned to watch the family reassemble. And as Sarah sank to her knees and took Emily to her chest, the world dissolved into a single, trembling present, where cries of joy and sobs of relief braided together into a sound so raw it made even the most practiced officers speechless. Later, under the bright lights of a relief camp set up in the yard, people would argue about the how and the why as if they were 2 sides of a single coin, and scientific minds would hypothesize about the cat's acute hearing and the way felines can detect micro sounds that adults cannot, and others would remark on the uncanny ability of animals to read emotional registers in humans and move toward need. And yet whatever explanation one accepted, it did not change the fact that a baby had been curled beneath leaves for hours, and that a small black cat had been the pivot that made the discovery possible. And within the quiet of Sarah's arms, with Emily asleep and warm, Shadow curled at her feet and blinked slowly, the kind of slow, trusting blink that feels like forgiveness and recognition merged into one peaceful gesture. That night the town slept in fits and starts, neighbors offering casseroles and coffee, and quiet hands instead of speeches, because no words could match what had happened. By morning the story had already pushed its way into the small news cycle and into the soft mouths of people passing on the sidewalk, and whether one framed it as pure coincidence or as the subtle intelligence of an animal that understands risk and care, the result was the same. A family stitched back together, and a black cat whose ordinary existence shifted overnight into something like legend. Though Shadow himself remained indifferent to accolades, content to nap in sunbeams, to watch Emily play, to sit on the fence and survey the yard as if the world had returned to the routine that made him feel safe. And in the quiet corners of that household where reality had been thinnest, Sarah sat late into the night with Emily asleep in a warm crook, and watched Shadow polish his paw as if nothing unusual had happened. And the simplicity of that scene, a mother awake, a child breathing softly, a cat doing the small domestic work of being a cat, felt more miraculous than any hyperbolic claim could. The rescue had been real, brutal in its urgency, miraculous in its conclusion, and in those first hours the question that hung in every whispered conversation was not whether animals understood, but whether humans could learn to listen better, to trust instincts that come wrapped in fur and whiskers, to accept that sometimes the most unexpected things are the ones that save us. The house was supposed to return to normal after the shock eased, but normal does not return on command, especially not after a day where the world nearly slipped off its axis. So the hours that followed the rescue were filled with a series of small, precise adjustments in how everyone moved and breathed, as if the family had stepped into a version of reality where every sound carried significance and every quiet moment demanded acknowledgement. Sarah found herself watching Emily more closely than before, not with paranoia but with a tenderness sharpened by the memory of loss barely avoided. And Daniel, who had always been steady and pragmatic, now found his voice catching unexpectedly when he looked at his daughter sleeping, the weight of what could have happened settling on him in waves that made his hands rest longer on her back, counting breaths he no longer took for granted. Shadow, who had become the unspoken center of the household in the wake of the rescue, seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. He moved with a protective calm through the rooms, not seeking attention but placing himself always at the threshold between the house and the outside world, choosing positions that allowed him to watch the doors, the baby's sleeping spot, and the windows that faced the woods. And though Sarah laughed softly at herself for feeling safer because a cat sat by the sliding glass door, she could not deny the quiet steadiness he brought into the space, the way his presence eased, the tightness in her chest during those first fragile days. News of what had happened spread far beyond the neighborhood, faster than anyone expected. People shared the story because it felt like hope wrapped in fur, a reminder that miracles sometimes come in small, quiet forms. And soon the phone rang with calls from local reporters and radio stations who wanted interviews. But Sarah and Daniel declined them politely because it felt wrong to turn their trauma into a spectacle, and because the rescue had not felt like a headline to them. It had felt like the universe giving them a second chance. Instead, they focused on returning to the rhythms of their life, even as the echoes of the experience lingered like a faint tremor beneath their daily actions. At night, the woods behind the yard looked different to them, not threatening exactly, but deeper, more complex, as if the trees carried the memory of what had unfolded and breathed it back in slow exhalations when the wind touched their branches. Daniel, who had walked those woods 100 times without thinking, now stood on the back porch in the evenings, coffee in hand, staring at the forest with a mix of gratitude and unease, and Shadow often joined him, sitting beside his leg and following his gaze into the dark, with eyes that seemed to reflect more understanding than any human could articulate. Emily, blissfully unaware of the emotional storm that had swept around her, resumed her normal rhythms, her curiosity bubbling, back to life with the bright urgency only babies possess. And Sarah found herself feeling gratitude each time she heard Emily's laughter ring out from the living room, because it felt like the world had reset itself, and yet the memory of that empty blanket in the yard lingered in the back of her mind like a bruise, not painful to touch, but impossible to forget. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself thinking often about the moment Shadow appeared at the edge of the woods, the clarity of his posture, the way he had looked back at the volunteers as if issuing an invitation disguised as a simple feline pause. She replayed that image in quiet moments and wondered whether there had been something deeper at work, an instinct older than human logic, something woven into the secret intelligence animals often carry without fanfare. Daniel, who preferred explanations grounded in the tangible, initially dismissed the idea that Shadow had acted out of anything more than coincidence or random wandering, but even he could not ignore what witnesses had described or what he himself had seen in the videos neighbors took, the pacing, the stopping to wait, the deliberate angles of movement. Eventually one evening he admitted, voice low like someone confessing a truth he had resisted, that sometimes animals understand urgency long before humans catch up. For several afternoons after the rescue, neighbors swung by to check in, dropping off casseroles, cookies, or just quiet company, not because the family needed food, but because everyone needed to fill the silence with something warm. And Shadow, usually reserved and independent, allowed himself to be petted by people he normally kept distance from, as if he understood the communal gratitude swirling around him. One evening, as the sun dipped gold behind the trees, Sarah found Shadow sitting near Emily's playpen, his body curved protectively around the soft corner of the mat where she liked to push her wooden blocks. Emily reached toward him with her small hand, and Shadow dipped his head gently into her palm, a gesture so slow and deliberate that Sarah felt emotion swell in her throat, because there was something sacred in the exchange, a wordless recognition between two beings who had shared a moment of danger, without even knowing it at the same time. It was Daniel who suggested they install a small wooden gate across the back door, even though Emily was still too young to open it, because he said it made him feel better, and because they both understood that fear loses power when met with practical action. Sarah agreed, and they spent an evening smoothing the wood, installing hinges, adjusting the latch, and when it was done, Sarah stepped back and laughed quietly at how such a simple frame of wood could make them feel like the world had regained structure. The next morning, the rhythm of the house had shifted again, this time in a gentler direction. Sarah moved through the kitchen humming, Emily babbled from her blanket, and Shadow sat upright near the new gate, as if inspecting the craftsmanship and approving it with silent feline authority. And for the first time in days, Sarah felt her chest loosen, not from relief, but from stability, the sense that their lives were expanding around the event, rather than shrinking beneath its weight. Yet something else had subtly changed, something so delicate, it took several days for Sarah to acknowledge it. Shadow had begun to watch the woods more intently than before, not with fear or suspicion, but with an attentiveness that seemed purposeful. He would sit at the window for long stretches, ears perked but body relaxed, as if listening to a frequency humans could not perceive, and sometimes at night, Sarah would wake and find him sitting at the end of the hallway, facing the back door with that same patient concentration. One afternoon, when Emily was napping and Daniel was at work, Sarah carried a basket of laundry to the backyard to hang it, and as she stepped onto the porch, she noticed Shadow seated near the gate, staring into the woods with such stillness that she paused without meaning to, following his gaze into the trees. The forest was quiet in that late afternoon way, where sunlight slants between branches in dusty ribbons, and for a moment Sarah felt something ripple through her, a sense of connection to that place, not fear, but awareness, as if the woods themselves were acknowledging her. Shadow blinked slowly and turned back, toward her, and Sarah, who had been wrestling with lingering guilt despite everyone telling her it wasn't her fault, suddenly felt tears burn behind her eyes, because the look he gave her was so calm, so grounding, that it felt like forgiveness. The days turned into a week, and the intensity of the search and rescue event slowly diffused into the ordinary patterns of meals, naps, conversations, and chores. But the story continued to ripple through the community in small, meaningful ways. Neighbors checked their yards more frequently. Parents walked hand in hand with their children, even on familiar streets. And a quiet gratitude settled over the block, like a gentle blanket. One night, while Emily slept in her crib, and the house hummed with the soft sounds of dishwasher water, refrigerator hum, and distant cicadas, Sarah and Daniel sat on the couch, wrapped in the same blanket, their legs tangled and their shoulders leaning together in the easy intimacy that comes after shared fear and shared relief. Daniel ran his fingers through his hair and exhaled, and he said the words that had been hanging between them since the rescue. "I keep thinking about how close we were to losing everything." Sarah pressed her forehead to his shoulder and whispered, "But we didn't." Shadow, curled near their feet, lifted his head at the sound of their voices and blinked in their direction, then settled back into sleep, and Daniel reached down absent-mindedly to rest his hand against the cat's back, a gesture he never would have made a month earlier, because Shadow had always been independent, proud, slightly aloof. The fact that the cat accepted the contact without shifting away felt like another thread weaving the family closer, repairing the invisible tear the rescue had left behind. Still, beneath the calm surface of the days that followed, something else was beginning to take shape, a subtle shift in Shadow's behavior that neither Sarah nor Daniel recognized right away. Something that would eventually pull them back into the woods in a way they could not yet predict, because the story of the baby found among the leaves was not the end of Shadow's connection to those trees. It was only the beginning. For now, though, the family breathed easier, healed slowly, and allowed the simple rhythm of life to knit them back together, unaware that the woods behind their home held more secrets than any of them yet understood, and that the cat who had saved their daughter was not done, guiding them, not by instinct alone, but by a deeper thread of purpose that would reveal itself only when the next chapter unfurled. The morning after the household finally felt steady again unfolded, with a kind of gentle quiet that Sarah hadn't realized she missed. Sunlight slipped through the curtains in slow, warm beams that painted the living room in soft gold, and Emily babbled to herself in her crib while Shadow sat at the foot of the bed as if supervising the beginning of the day, his tail curled neatly around his paws in a posture that radiated calm attention. And Sarah stretched beneath the blankets, feeling, perhaps, for the first time since the rescue, something close to peace. But as she moved through her morning routine, pouring coffee, scooping Emily into her arms, stepping onto the back porch to let the crisp air touch her skin, she found herself glancing toward the woods again and again, not with fear but with a faint pull of curiosity that seemed to echo from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, almost as if a thread connected her to that place now, tied there by the memory of Shadow leading the rescuers through the trees. It was mid-morning when Daniel joined her on the porch, rubbing sleep from his eyes, leaning against the wooden railing as he exhaled a slow breath that rose in a pale cloud against the cool air. They stood together in a comfortable silence until he said something she didn't expect, that he kept replaying the moment Shadow stopped at the clearing where Emily was found, not because of the fear it evoked, but because of the uncanny precision of it, the sense that the cat wasn't simply wandering but guiding, moving with intention rather than instinct. Sarah nodded because she'd been thinking the same thing, but hadn't yet said it aloud. There was something about Shadow's behavior that didn't fit neatly into logic, something that made her wonder whether animals sense things humans overlooked, whether they perceived distress not through sound or sight alone, but through something subtler and older, a kind of emotional radar that picked up human fear like a signal. Shadow, as if hearing his name in their thoughts rather than their words, slipped quietly onto the porch and positioned himself between them, staring into the woods with the same focused stillness that had become more frequent over the last week, and Sarah felt a faint tightening in her chest because she recognized that posture now, the silent alertness, the listening beneath the surface of things. The day unfolded as most days do when families try to find balance after upheaval. Laundry folded. On the couch, toys scattered and then neatly placed back into baskets. Emily's laughter bouncing off the walls, Daniel repairing a loose hinge in the hallway, Sarah preparing lunch while humming to a song she couldn't remember the name of. Yet beneath the ease of their movements ran a quiet undercurrent, a shared awareness that the woods behind their house no longer felt like just trees and soil, but like a presence observing them with patient eyes. Mid-afternoon settled into the house in a slow, golden hush, the kind of warmth that makes everything feel softer. Emily napped in her crib, Daniel dozed for a few minutes on the couch with his arm thrown across his forehead, and Sarah sat by the window with a cup of tea, staring absent-mindedly into the yard where the shadows of branches swayed gently. And it was in that stillness she noticed something strange. Shadow wasn't in any of his usual spots. He wasn't under the dining table. He wasn't curled on the back of the couch. He wasn't perched. On the windowsill, a faint unease began to rise inside her. Not fear exactly, but the sense that a puzzle piece had shifted out of place. She called his name softly at first, then a little louder, walking from room to room with growing urgency until she reached the back door and saw it. The gate they had installed after the rescue was slightly ajar. Not open, just unlatched. Barely enough for a small, determined body to slip through. For a moment, she stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, because the sight triggered a flash of memory she wasn't ready for. The image of the empty blanket, the volunteers running, the woods swallowing sound. "Daniel!" she called, her voice tighter than she intended, and he sat up instantly, reading the alarm on her face before the words even left her mouth. "He's outside," she whispered. "Shadow's outside." Daniel moved quickly to the porch, scanning the yard, and it took less than a heartbeat for them to see the faint ripple of movement near the tree. Line. A small black shape slipping with purpose between the ferns, tail low, body smooth and determined, and Sarah felt the same inexplicable pull she had felt days earlier, the sense that Shadow wasn't wandering. He was following something. Daniel turned to her, concern etched across his expression, and for a moment they debated whether to follow. But something in the way Shadow paused at the edge of the woods before disappearing into the trees made Sarah step forward instinctively, her hand resting against the porch railing as if anchoring her, while her mind tried to make sense of what he was doing. The cat had looked back just as he had during the rescue, not at them specifically, but toward the house, as if checking to make sure the family saw where he was going, as if leaving a trail of intention rather than a random path. Daniel put a gentle hand on Sarah's arm and said they should wait, that Shadow always came home, that the last week had left them jumpy, imagining meaning where none existed. But Sarah shook her head slowly because this wasn't anxiety inventing connections. She knew the difference between fear and instinct, and what she felt now wasn't fear. It was recognition. Shadow had not returned to the woods by accident. She didn't know how she knew that, only that she did. An hour passed and Shadow didn't come back, not even when the sun began to dip behind the trees and the forest took on the deeper colors of evening, and Sarah paced the living room holding Emily on her hip, while Daniel stepped outside every few minutes to check the yard, calling the cat's name in a voice that tried to sound casual but cracked around the edges. When night settled fully, bringing with it the hum of insects and the cool slide of darkness across the backyard, Daniel suggested they take flashlights and check the perimeter of the woods, just to reassure themselves. But Sarah shook her head because the idea of stepping into the trees after sunset made her chest tighten. And, more than that, because something in her felt certain that this wasn't a situation they were meant to chase. Shadow had gone into the woods with purpose, and she sensed, deep in a place beyond logic, that he would return when he was ready. So they waited. They kept the porch light on. They left the back door slightly open so the warm glow of the kitchen spilled into the yard like a beacon. Emily slept tucked between them on the couch, while they whispered in low voices about what might be happening, and Daniel wrapped his arm around Sarah's shoulders because he could feel her tension building with each passing minute. It wasn't until nearly midnight, when the house had softened into the slow rhythm of tired breaths and distant night sounds, that Sarah heard it. A faint rustle outside the back door, so delicate she thought at first it was only wind. Then came a soft, familiar sound. A single, gentle meow. Sarah was on her feet before she realized she had moved, crossing the living room in a rush of relief and emotion as she reached the back door and pulled it open. And there he was, Shadow sitting calmly on the porch, as though returning from an ordinary evening stroll. But something was different, something subtle, something in the way he held himself. His fur was dusted with fragments of leaves and tiny flecks of dirt, and when he blinked up at her with those deep, amber eyes, she felt a jolt of recognition. Not of danger, but of meaning, as if he carried the woods back with him, the way a messenger carries a letter. Daniel joined her at the doorway, his breath catching as he knelt to check the cat's paws and sides for injuries. But Shadow was unharmed, not even a scratch, his heartbeat steady beneath Daniel's hand. Still, when Sarah lifted him gently into her arms, she felt a faint tremor run through his body, not fear, but something like urgency, as if he wanted to move, but accepted the embrace because he understood she needed it. Shadow rested his head against her shoulder for a moment before slipping free and padding into the living room, heading straight toward Emily's crib. He placed himself beneath it, curling into a position he had never chosen before, his body angled toward the window that faced the woods, and Sarah felt her breath stall at the sight because the pose was almost protective, as if whatever had drawn him into the forest was somehow connected to them, as if this story was not finished, not even close. Deep into the night, while Daniel slept lightly. Beside her and Emily breathed in small, steady puffs, Sarah lay awake, staring at the faint outline of Shadow beneath the crib. And though she didn't know what the next part of their story would reveal, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The woods had changed something in him, and whatever he had sensed out there in the darkness was coming closer. Sarah kept walking deeper into the woods behind the cat as the temperature continued to drop, and the breathable fog around her grew thicker, creating an atmosphere of silence so complete that even her own footsteps seemed muted. And in that strange quiet, she realized how surreal everything had become because she was a grown woman, with a rational mind who understood the world in practical terms. Yet here she was, following a black cat through a forest in the middle of the night, searching for a missing baby who might be fighting for her life. And somehow she felt that this cat, this unexpected guide, knew exactly where to go, so she refused to let fear slow her down. As Sarah moved forward, she felt her heartbeat grow heavier with each step, and she kept thinking about Lily and how small she was, and how terrifying this must be for her. So every branch snapping under her shoes echoed in her chest, like a reminder that time was running out and she couldn't afford hesitation. And even though she wanted to call out for the cat to slow down or make some noise to reassure her that she wasn't imagining all of this, the animal simply kept gliding forward with calm determination, as if it had a plan that she wasn't meant to understand but only follow. A few minutes later, Sarah noticed the ground sloping downward toward a narrow ravine, where the moonlight barely touched the earth, and when she looked at the cat, she saw it pause at the top of the slope and stare back at her with those same bright eyes that seemed almost human in the intensity of their focus. And she realized that this was the most serious signal the cat had given all night, so she took a deep breath, tightened her grip on the flashlight, and carefully descended toward the darkness below while the cat silently waited at the bottom, like a sentinel guarding something fragile and important. As soon as Sarah reached the final step of the slope, she felt the air shift and she sensed that they were close, maybe closer than she dared to hope. So she swept the flashlight across the ground in a slow arc, trying to catch any hint of color or movement. And then her breath caught in her throat because she saw something small and pale near a fallen log, something that didn't belong to the forest. So she rushed forward, trembling with anticipation and dread, and the moment she knelt beside it, her chest tightened with overwhelming emotion, because there, curled up and barely moving, was Lily's tiny hand sticking out from beneath a thin blanket covered in dirt and leaves. Sarah's voice cracked as she whispered, "Lily and sweetheart, I'm here." Even though she knew the baby couldn't hear her clearly, but she needed to say it, needed the world to register that this impossible night was finally turning toward hope. And when she lifted the blanket, she found Lily alive, cold, frightened, and crying softly with a sound so weak it shattered Sarah's heart. So she wrapped the baby in her coat without hesitation and held her close against her chest, giving her warmth and whispering promises that everything was going to be okay, all while the cat sat inches away, watching with a calm expression that made Sarah wonder if the animal somehow understood the gravity of what it had done. Her hands trembling, Sarah quickly grabbed her radio and whispered, "I found her. I found Lily. She's alive." And although her voice was shaking, the message carried through loud and clear, prompting Officer Ramirez's voice to respond with a mixture of disbelief, relief, and urgency, as he told her to stay put because the rescue team was running to her location. But before she could answer, Sarah looked toward the cat, who seemed to relax now that its mission was complete. And in that moment, she felt something indescribable, something like gratitude mixed with awe, because without this animal she would never have found the baby in a place the search teams hadn't even planned to look. While she kneeled there holding Lily close to her chest and trying to steady her breathing, she felt tears form in her eyes because the emotional weight of the moment finally broke through the survival focus she'd been running on, and she realized that the cat wasn't just extraordinary. This animal had acted with a level of intuition and purpose beyond anything she had ever witnessed, and she kept thinking about how strange it was that on a night filled with worry and fear, the only creature who had seemed to know the right path from the very beginning was an unexpected black cat, silently waiting outside a cabin like a guardian no one had asked for, but everyone desperately needed. As the distant sound of rescuers running through the woods grew louder, Sarah lowered her head in exhaustion and relief, hugging Lily more tightly and whispering soft reassurances to the trembling baby, while the cat slowly stepped closer until it gently touched its head against Sarah's knee in a gesture so delicate and intentional that she gasped because it felt almost like a thank you or a farewell. And she looked into its eyes one more time, realizing she would never forget this moment for the rest of her life. And just as Officer Ramirez and the rescue team burst through the trees with flashlights cutting through the darkness, the cat turned away silently and began walking back toward the path it had come from, disappearing between the shadows, as if it had never been there at all, leaving Sarah with a feeling of wonder so profound that she didn't even try to explain it, because she knew that what had happened tonight went far beyond logic and into the territory of rare stories that people never forget. Stories that remind us that the world is filled with mysteries we may never fully understand. When the rescue team reached Sarah, she felt her entire body finally relax as the adrenaline that had kept her steady began to drain away, and she allowed Officer Ramirez to help her stand up, while another medic carefully checked Lily's temperature, breathing, and responsiveness, confirming that although the baby was cold and dehydrated, she was stable and would recover fully with quick treatment, a confirmation that made Sarah's knees grow weak with overwhelming relief, because every worst-case scenario she had been pushing out of her mind all night had finally been replaced by the reality that the child was safe in her arms. As the team wrapped Lily in warm emergency blankets and prepared to take her back to the clearing, Ramirez turned to Sarah with an expression she had never seen on the usually composed officer, a look that held admiration, disbelief, and something like gratitude. And he told her that finding Lily in such difficult terrain at night was nothing short of a miracle, but Sarah shook her head immediately because she knew the truth. She knew she had been wandering in circles before the night turned in their favor, and she pointed toward the trees while saying in a voice that cracked with emotion, "It wasn't me. It was the cat. The black cat led me here." Ramirez frowned in confusion at first because he hadn't seen any animal on his way down the slope, but Sarah insisted, telling him how the cat had appeared out of nowhere, how it had waited, guided, and even stopped exactly where Lily was hidden. And although he didn't say much back, she could tell by the look in his eyes that he was trying to make sense of something he couldn't logically explain, and she realized that no amount of words would capture the strange intelligence she had witnessed in that animal's movements. As they began walking up the slope, Sarah kept glancing behind her, hoping to see those bright eyes again, even in the distance, if only for a moment to acknowledge the silent hero who had saved a life. But the forest remained still and shadowed, almost too quiet, and she felt a soft ache of sadness that the cat had slipped away so quickly because she had wanted to thank it properly. Yet she also understood that some mysteries are not meant to be held onto, but simply witnessed and remembered for what they truly are: rare, extraordinary moments that arrive without warning and leave without explanation. Once they reached the top of the path, the clearing was transformed into a bright scene of flashing lights, radios, and coordinated movement as more officers and paramedics converged to assist. And when the first responders saw Lily in Sarah's arms, they collectively exhaled, some even letting out small cheers of disbelief because they all knew how slim the chances had been after so many hours in the cold darkness. But now they were standing in the middle of a miracle created not by equipment or strategy, but by an unexpected guide that none of them had seen coming. Sarah handed Lily to the paramedics with gentle care, watching them secure the baby into an insulated carrier before rushing her to the ambulance waiting at the edge of the forest. And as she followed behind with Ramirez, she kept thinking about how close they had come to a tragedy and how easily the ending could have been different if she had ignored the quiet signal outside her cabin, a realization that made her shiver with the weight of what could have been and deepened her gratitude for the strange chain of events that had led to this moment. An hour later, after giving her official statement and ensuring that Lily was safe with the medical team, Sarah stood near the edge of the woods where the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and she let her eyes drift across the darkness one last time, hoping for a glimpse of movement or a pair of glowing eyes watching from the shadows. But there was nothing there, just the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant hum of emergency vehicles, and she felt a soft, almost peaceful certainty that the cat had done what it came to do and had moved on without expecting anything in return. Ramirez approached her and asked one more time if she was certain about everything she had described, and Sarah simply nodded because she knew what she had seen and felt, and she sensed that even though he might never fully believe the story, he respected her enough to understand that something beyond normal explanation had happened here. So he placed a hand on her shoulder and told her that Lily would be reunited with her family as soon as she was cleared, which made Sarah smile for the first time since the search had begun. When Sarah finally drove home, the early light of dawn was starting to appear on the horizon, casting soft colors across the sky that made the forest look less threatening and more like a place that held secrets quietly rather than loudly. And as she parked near her cabin, she paused, listening for any sound, half hoping to hear the soft padding of paws walking through the underbrush toward her porch. But the only thing she heard was the wind moving through the trees, which felt strangely comforting now that she knew what the woods were capable of offering. For days after the rescue, the townspeople talked endlessly about the miraculous discovery, speculating on how Sarah had found the baby and what intuition or stroke of luck had guided her through terrain that experienced officers had struggled with. But even though she tried to explain the truth, how a quiet black cat had waited outside her cabin and led her straight to Lily, people either smiled politely or raised their eyebrows with disbelief. Yet none of their reactions bothered her, because she remembered every detail clearly and carried the memory like a private gift that didn't require anyone else's approval. A week later, Sarah returned to the forest with a small basket of food, not because she expected the cat to appear, but because it felt like the right way to say thank you for the life it had helped save. So she placed the basket on the edge of the trail and whispered, "If you're out there, I hope you're safe," letting the words drift into the trees where they blended with the soft sounds of nature. And although the cat didn't come out that day, she felt a warm sense of closure knowing that, wherever it was, it had changed her life forever. And as she walked back to her cabin, Sarah realized that the world was filled with countless stories, some logical, some impossible, and some that lived in the space between the two. And she understood that Lily's story was one that would stay with her forever, a story of instinct, chance, and an animal that had appeared from the shadows with a purpose no one could explain, proving that sometimes help arrives in the most unexpected form. And if this story touched something inside you and made you feel, even for a moment, that animals understand more about us than science can explain, then take a deep breath and stay with that feeling just a bit longer while I invite you to subscribe to When Animals Feel. Because every week we bring new stories that remind us of loyalty, instinct, courage, and the silent emotions living in the hearts of the animals who walk beside us. And if you believe the world needs more kindness and more stories like this one, share this video so that this message can reach others who may need it today.